code for clinical trials experience also be used for clinical studies?
So thank you for the question. So the answer is no. The LOINC for clinical trials experience is reserved for when that subsection appears in Section 6, adverse reactions. The clinical study section has had a LOINC code and name for many years, so that would continue to be used for clinical studies, which is Section 14 in PLR labeling.
All right, microphone number 2, please.
This should be a low-hanging fruit question for you. This is an annotation question. So for new labels, annotated labels, how does the agency prefer the label be annotated? In text boxes, comment bubbles, footnotes, or endnotes?
Thanks for the slow ball. No, but that's a great question. So on the first page where the highlights is, we would prefer that there isn't any page numbering. If there is an annotation, it would be at the bottom of the page and simply just the page number. Did that answer your question? No. I missed the slow ball.
So for annotations throughout the label where you're going to insert maybe a hyperlink to to a clinical study or 27234, how does the agency like to have that?
You're referring to hyperlinks?
Well, yeah, I am.
Okay.
But so you could put those hyperlinks in a document a number of different ways. You could put them as a text box, comment bubble, footnote, endnote.
So yeah, certainly. I mean, I don't know if we have any definitive guidance on this, but I would say definitely a hyperlink. The comment bubbles will get hopefully removed. So I would say a hyperlink. If
both, I mean both. I actually mean both. So if you're submitting an annotated label, both in responses, I would assume you'd like to have those in a comment bubble, because the FDA, we received comments in a comment bubble, so I'm assuming you'd like a comment bubble back.
I think that would really end up being to the discretion of the division that you're dealing with. I don't think we have a guidance or anything.
Yeah, I'm sure there's no guidance.
Yeah,
but
so
there's some. It's one of those things. You know what I mean? It's not worthy enough to have a guidance on it, but it's a really common thing.
Yeah. Well, I would leave that to the discretion of the division. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, microphone number 2, nice and close for me, please.
So my question is for John. Are there any guidances or regulations around how long the highlight section should be, and what can you do if the length is longer or shorter than recommended?
That's a fantastic question, and we get this a lot. There is in 201.57, I believe, there is a regulation on the length of the highlights. If it is clinically imperative that the highlights are longer, you can request a waiver to the FDA to have the highlights extended past half a page. Excellent question.
All right, let's take an online question, please.
If a labeling has been PLLR converted, is there any use for the LOINC codes for labor and delivery section and nursing mother section in that SPL?
So if the labeling has been PLLR converted, there should not be a labor and delivery or nursing mother section in that labeling any longer. So no, there would not be any role for those LOINC codes in that document. The LOINC codes of interest would be lactation for subsection 8.2 and the LOINC code for females and males of reproductive potential for 8.3.
Okay, microphone number 2, please.
Hi, this is a question for John. And the examples of the 5 common mistakes that you were showing us, that's for the version that's going to go on drugs at FDA, not the back and forth version that we go back and forth with the division, correct?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I probably should have specified, yes, that's all of those examples, and what we were really focusing on is the final approved labeling that are seen on drugs at FDA. Obviously, in the correspondence between the FDA and industry, there's expected to be review track changes, things like that. That's fine. But towards the end of cycle, the final submission, and what's posted on drugs at FDA, those should all be removed. Excellent question.
Okay, microphone number 1.
Yeah, quick question about the LOINC codes. I understand these are preferred, and I understand the reason for that. But is there any consideration from the FDA to inform or to, probably not part of the validation rules for XML, but to at least to inform sponsors that they should adjust their LOINC codes and to get it done that way?
Thank you for the question. So that was part of the purpose of developing this LOINC document. It was a different way of trying to disseminate this information, and we're still getting feedback from that. I'm aware that there's also an FDA SBL style sheet, and that's something that we'll definitely take back and consider.
Okay, next online question, please, Ray.
Does the SRPI cover the format and appearance topics that were discussed today?
The SERPI or SRPI, Selected Requirements of Prescribing Information, is based and composed entirely off of regulations and guidances. Some of the issues today were outside of the SERPI's purview. If we had time, we would certainly try to create guidances to cover these. Some examples that were within the SERPI purview would be the dates, the number of columns. I believe those would be the ones that were contained in the SERPI. Thank you.
All right, microphone number 2, please.
So from a XML composition perspective of the SPL files, a common observance that we find is, to that suboptimal labeling perspective, is the conflict between the approved labeling and then the style sheet formatting. A lot of times, as a third-party vendor, we'll hear, well, that SPL file doesn't match what was approved for drugs at FDA or drugs at FDA. So, for example, like footnotes resulting in not being linked anymore because the approved label may not be following the exact style sheet. Could you comment on that, and if there's anything being done to try to harmonize that information, or if it's more on industry to approach that?
For the question, I don't personally work on the style sheet. As I said, I'm not an informaticist, but I know what you're referring to. I think my focus was on something that I think is lower hanging fruit, which is the assignment of LOINC codes, and I don't believe that that is something that's impinged upon by the style sheet. I know that these new LOINC codes that I shared have not had any issues with validation. So I think one of the issues is just awareness of what they correspond to, because sometimes folks who author SPL may not know that. And as regulations and guidances change and new sections and subsections are named or renamed, we think that this document will help with conveying that information as well.
Okay, next online question, please.
You briefly mentioned FDA label. What is the difference between Dailymed and FDA label?
Thank you for the question, so that we could have a whole separate session on that. But just briefly, they're both online labeling repositories. They're free, publicly available. I think one of the most important things is that what they share, which is they use the same data. They share the same data source, and that is the SPL files that companies submit to FDA that are loaded into eList. There are differences in their interfaces. I find some of Dailymed has some features that are useful and unique. For example, there's a capsule tablet ID tool in Dailymed where you can enter identifying characteristics of a tablet or pill that's, I think, useful for consumers, and that can help them identify what that product is. FDA Label has a sort of a different layout that's useful for certain types of searches. It allows you to filter your searches, for example, by marketing category, so you can restrict your search to NDAs or BLAs. I think that's unique to FDA Label. And then there are some other differences between them in terms of how the information is presented. Each of them, I think, has their own value as labeling search tools.
Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left. If there's any questions, come up to the mic, but let's take our next online question, please.
Which LOINC code should be used if there's a subsection in warnings and precautions called renal impairment?
Thank you for the question. So if there is a renal impairment subsection in warnings and precautions, I guess as an aside, it would be, ideally, it wouldn't be called renal impairment. When you have warnings and precautions, the recommendation is for the subsection to characterize the risk. So would ideally say something like adverse reactions in patients with renal impairment or whatever the actual clinical concern is. But I know there are labeling out there that do have warnings and precautions subsections that may just be called renal or hepatic impairment. In those situations, we would recommend that you use the LOINC code for SPL unclassified for that subsection. And again, reserve the LOINC for renal impairment for when it appears in Section 8.
Okay, have we got another one, Ray?
How does the LOINC codes help with searchability? How does it differ from a simple word search on PDF?
Great question. So searching within a PDF is pretty limited. I think you can just use the find button in Adobe Acrobat to search within that document. You may also be able to do a compare document if you have a version of Adobe that allows you to do that. Resources like FDA Label or Dailymed allow you to search a broad swath of SPL. There's over 100,000 SPLs in those databases. So those databases use the LOINC code to decide whether that section or subsection exists. So if a user is interested in specifically searching a section or subsection, the LOINC code is really what's going to be the resource for the database. And if the LOINC code is optimally assigned, you'll get more accurate search results. When it isn't, you may not know, the user may not know what they're missing, but those SPLs that have suboptimal LOINC assignment will just not come back in the search results.
Okay, another online question, please, Ray.
Are the page numbers required or can they be removed entirely?
No, the page numbers are not required. You could put them, you can use them as you wish. We just ask that they don't inhibit the information or conflict with the information like I showed.
Okay. Another one back there, Ray?
Are there any plans to develop LOINC codes for headings that fall under a subsection such as risk summary?
Thank you for the question. So I'm not aware of any plans to develop LOINC codes for headings, if I understood the question right, within a subsection. It's an interesting idea. Just off the top of my head, I can think there potentially could be some challenges with that because there are potentials for duplication. So the questioner asked about the risk summary heading. That's present in subsection 8.1 pregnancy, but there's also a requirement for a risk summary heading in 8.2 lactation. So there may be some challenges with duplicate names that are unique to headings and subheadings, an issue that we don't have with sections and subsections in PLR. But it's an interesting idea. Thank you for the question.
All right, we got 1 minute left. Can we sneak in one last question from online, please?
Drugs at FDA only contain labels following the approval by FDA. As such, they would not include changes implemented via CBE, but still in review by FDA, and would not include changes implemented via annual report. Therefore, I would typically go to labels.fda.gov versus drugs at FDA. What would be your recommendation, though?
So you're correct that drugs at FDA contains the last FDA-approved labeling, and typically that aligns with what you'll find for that product on a site like Dailymed or FDA Label where the SPL is housed, but as the questioner noted, with certain changes, such as changes being affected supplements or annual reportable changes, there may temporarily at least be a difference between the labeling found on Dailymed or FDA Label and drugs at FDA. So ideally, if the user is interested in looking at the last FDA-approved labeling, drugs at FDA is the most reliable resource to find that. But the idea of having the most recently submitted labeling by companies posted to a site like Dailymed is that can convey additional, typically safety information that may be under FDA review at that time. For example, addition of an adverse reaction that's picked up in post-marketing that a company could propose to add to the labeling, update the SPL, and that gets posted to a site like Dailymed while it's being internally reviewed by FDA.
Okay, and that is all the time we have for questions for John and Farrokh. Please help me thank